Nama budaya. Gimana nggak? Nyamin 20.000 di kampus itu 20.000 orang. Banyak enak.
Universitas nasional yang kami cinta, lahir zaman revolusi, penuh halangan serta rintangan. Walau betapa beratnya, sulit pahit diderita, banyak korban benda dan rasa, kami pikul bersama. Dewan Guru, Dewan Kurator Mahasiswa, mari maju terus maju, pantang hati, bimbang dan ragu. Lanjutlah umurnya, perguruan yang kami cinta, tempat kami memetik sari ilmu dan akhlak budi. Merdeka Sentosa Jaya, aman damai seluruh dunia, itulah cita-cita putra putri Indonesia.
Prayer. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and participants. Welcome to International Conference on Social Science, or HLC, Solidarity, Creativity, and Connectivity, on November 24, 2021, here in Jakarta, Indonesia, with me, Gabriela Kisha, as your Master of Ceremony today. This international conference is held and hosted by National University in this 2021. And now, we are going to hear a wonderful welcoming speech from Rector National University. Please welcome and give applause to Dr. El Amri Bermawi Putra, MA.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the most gracious and the most merciful. Peace be upon you and God's mercy and blessings. His Excellency Mr. Tan Tohwi Yahya, Indonesian Ambassador to New Zealand. Distinguished Head of Higher Education Service Agency, Region 3, Professor Dr. Agus Setio Budi, MSc. Distinguished Rectors of Bakri University, Bina Nusantara University, Christian University, Muhammadiyah University, Rita Harapan University, and Professor Dr. University. Honorable speakers, Professor Stanislaw Tekencho of St. Petersburg State University, Dr. M. Alfad Alfian of Universitas Nasional, Associate Professor Doran Lee from Northeastern University, Associate Professor Jaime Ottman from University Malaysia Sabah. Dear all participants, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to thank you for being here to attend the International Conference and Social Science Publication Consortium under the theme Solidarity, Creativity, and Connectivity. This conference is participated by an array of experts, researchers, and faculty members from a number of universities, and I do hope that this will give benefits and contribution, in particular to relevant policymakers in the new normal era. As a rector of Universitas Nasional, I would like to express my sincere gratitude and welcome you all to the International Conference at Universitas Nasional. We feel honored and privileged to host this conference made possible thanks to close collaboration with prominent universities in Jakarta. It is our hope that through this conference, we will be able to exchange information on a wide variety of research findings to encourage innovation in the context of promoting the development of knowledge and technology, particularly in the new normal. His Excellency Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, it is a norm that scientific conferences of this kind have to be consistently encouraged as they serve as a means for academicians and researchers to disseminate their research finding for the benefit of the people at large. Last but not least, allow me to thank all of you for your participation in making this conference success that will give a priceless contribution to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. El Amri, for the welcoming and wonderful speech. Before we continue our event, I want to remind to all of the participants to open and turn on the camera. And let's continue to the next speech. Will be delivered by our special keynote speech, far away from New Zealand. Give a big applause to His Excellency Tan Tohwi Yahya.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Kia ora, Greetings from Wellington, New Zealand. I'm Tantowi Yahya, Indonesian Ambassador to New Zealand, Samoa, Kingdom of Tonga, Cook Islands, and Norway. They are all in the Pacific. And following our growing involvement in the region, I have also been appointed as the first Indonesia's roving ambassador to the Pacific. Distinguished speakers, panelists, and moderator, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking the Konsorsiums for Social Sciences and Lembaga Layanan Pendidikan Tinggi Wilayah 3 DKI Jakarta for the kind invitations for me to speak in this forum. This international conference on social science speaks a volume of Indonesia's commitment to provide platform for discussions on issues that affect societies. The theme solidarity, creativity, and connectivity is arguably has been our way of lives in a nutshell in recent times. As we grapple through the pandemic, we have learned the true meaning of solidarity from the grassroots all the way to interstate relations. No countries can cope with the virus and its devastating subsequent impacts alone. They reach out, lend their hands, and assist one another. As is the severity of the disruptions caused by the pandemic, we have been forced to be creative. People around the world came up with ways to keep the wheel moving despite unforeseen limitations. We now know that the extent of what informations, communications, and technology, or ICT, can provide in keeping our work alive and businesses afloat. For instance, the government of Indonesia, through the Embassy of Indonesia in Wellington, organized the biggest and most comprehensive exhibitions in the Pacific called the Second Pacific Expositions last month. Despite its full virtual format, the event was a success, recording total business commitment valued at around 1.4 trillion rupiah and attended by 10,000 visitors. It was the first large-scale virtual event organized by the embassy that requires our utmost creativity. Now, in terms of connectivity, I think this is very much something that we can describe as self-explanatory. Connectivity is key. It has become second nature for us to communicate through digital devices, and in the last 2 years, it has been an even more normal. Working from home, online purchases, video conferencing, virtual business matching, webinars, and virtual trade exhibitions are only to name a few notable activities made possible by ICT. It went to that extent, in my case, the ceremony of presenting letter of credentials from our President Joko Widodo to the government of the Cook Islands was done through a virtual ceremony in their High Commission office here in Wellington. It limited the interactions which I preferred, but still, it served the purpose during this so-called new normal. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is my firm belief that despite its adverse impacts, the current pandemic has given science more than an adequate amount of lessons learned. In that context, of course, social sciences are not excluded. As I peruse the list of disciplines under the politic, international relations, sociology, and communications umbrella, I couldn't help but sense the constructive inputs and recommendations at the end of this event. This conference encapsulates the spirit of Indonesia's progressive nature in discussing current issues that matter. As you convene and exchange thoughts, knowledge, expertise, and informations, please bear in mind that the need for measurable, practical, and implementable solutions are of increasing importance nowadays. Against that backdrop, I call on the distinguished speakers, panelists, and participants to place importance on recommendations that are not only sound on academic journals, but also applicable. To end, I wish everyone an enjoyable and fruitful conference. May this event be a success. Stay safe, stay healthy. I thank you. Billahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi 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 Om. Salam sejahtera dan salam sehat.
Thank you so much, His Excellency, for the wonderful speech. Now, we're going to hear and watch inspiring presentations from our invited speaker. First of all, I'm going to introduce them. First of all, we have Professor Stanislav Kachenko from St. Petersburg State University. Good morning, Professor, and привет.
Привет, добрый день, good morning.
Thank you. And the second one, we have Dr. M. Alfian M. MSE from National University. Good morning, Dr. Alfian.
Good morning and fine, thanks.
And the third, we have Assistant Professor Dorn Lee from Northeastern University. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And the fourth one, we have Assistant Professor Zaini Ottman from Malaysia Sabah University. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Assalamualaikum. Thank you for inviting me for this very precious conference.
Thank you so much, Professor. And the last one, not but least, Professor Richard Choffel from University of Melbourne. Good morning or evening local time, Professor Richard Choffel. All right. And with our moderator today, Mr. Fadlan Musaki, Master of Philosophy, Master of Law. Good morning, Mr. Fadlan. Are you ready?
Morning. Yes, of course. I'm already ready.
All right, Mr. Fadlan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the Master of Ceremony. And I just want to say welcome again for this prestigious international conference with the theme of solidarity, creativity, and the connectivity. And I just want to, before I would like to invite the first invited speaker, I just want to remind that the purpose of this executing national and international conference is to provide scientific forum to facilitate the exchange of information on knowledge about the civilization and the culture, provide in-depth knowledge about the current social, political, communication development, provide the scope of opportunity for research and academic to extend the research findings and talk to society and to participate in development science. I'm really happy that there are a number of speakers from different part of the world here, and without wasting our time, I would like to invite our first invited speaker, Professor Tachenko Stanislav. I'm so sorry if I'm not pronounce your name very well. Professor Stanislav, are you here with me?
Yes, I'm here and I'm ready.
Okay, good morning. And before we allow you to give your time to present the presentation, I would like to introduce a little bit more about your profile. Professor Tachenko Stanislav is a professor of international political economy and also the director of MA program Diplomacy of Russian Federation and Foreign Countries from the School of International Relations, St. Petersburg State University. In 1992, Stanislav Tachenko graduated from Faculty of History, the St. Petersburg State University, and in 1994 to 2012 has defended 2 PhD dissertation in history and economic, as well as a doctoral dissertation in Economics at St. Petersburg State University and St. Petersburg Economic University. The research interest is the international political economy, Russian diplomacy, and Russian economy. And the professor already published more than 13 books and 170 articles published in 14 countries. And the selected one of the books is titled Military Cooperation in GIS and Influence of NATO, Theory and Practice, European Monetary Integration, Efficiency of Diplomacy, so on and so forth. There are a lot of books that I think it will be wasting time if we read it one by one. So without wasting our time, we give the opportunity and we give the time to Professor Tekensov Stanislav. The time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that organizers will launch my presentation. Is it okay? Okay, if no, I start my presentation. My topic is vaccine diplomacy, security, and international system. And first of all, thank you so much, organizers, for inviting me to speak, to talk about such a broad topic. I divided my presentation into two parts. First of all, I present to you IP, International Political Economy analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic and 4 aspects of crisis which pandemic brought to our international system. And after that, we go for 4 areas of opportunities. So the international community have already demonstrated an ability to cooperate, or at least there is a growing understanding that opportunities are coming in the sphere of interstate cooperation in dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, and opportunities are utilized by community. First of all, I should say that COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the crisis of public policy and public institutions, large disparities in vaccine access and inefficiency of public institutions in almost all states to cope with it. We have seen the shortages of vaccines, of masks, of other facilities for dealing with COVID-19 all around the world, United States, Italy, Russia, and in East Asia. So we may speak here about the phenomenal vaccine divide, when while over 60% of the population in advanced economies are fully vaccinated, and some are now receiving the booster shots, about 93% of the population in low-income countries remain unvaccinated. They don't have access to varieties of vaccine to deal with it. COVID-19 crisis also brought a big pressure on labor market. If you'll see on my slide number 4, there is statistics about the employment rate in advanced economy, in emerging economy, and we'll see that as a result of that crisis, the most vulnerable groups of population, first of all, youth and low-skilled workers, are suffering the most, and especially in emerging economies. The rate of unemployment in these 2 groups, as well as among women, are growing faster than in any other part of the world. Besides of that, there is a problem of economic crisis which hit the global economy since the second quarter of year 2020. COVID-19 pandemic outbreaks in critical links of global value-added chains have resulted in a longer than expected supply disruptions, slowing some growth of industry and services, as well as rising inflation in many countries. I will come to the issue of inflation later, but it's very important to indicate that the pressure on all aspects of socio-economic life from the COVID-19 is really enormous. There is dangerous divergence in economic prospects across countries. On the global, regional, and national level dimension, we can see that impact. For example, supply shortage alongside the release of pent-up demand and the rebound in commodity prices. For example, we can, as a result of the pandemic, we find out that some countries have a monopoly on rare earth metals, like China or, for example, Kazakhstan. Their supply of coal to global market, on regional markets, especially in Asia, is declining. natural gas is hitting records in terms of its price all around the world, especially here in Europe. Consumer price inflation is increasing rapidly. In most cases, the rising inflation reflects pandemic-related supply-demand mismatches and higher commodity prices compared to their low base from a year 2020. If you look in the slide number 6, you will see that there are growing inflation pressure on the global economy. If initial reaction of different markets, regional markets in Asia, Europe, and Latin America has been the declining prices for consumer price index and the declining core consumer price index, as a result of quantitative easing, so different programs of social support provided by governments, we have now see the record-breaking levels of inflation for previous at least quarter century in Europe and in other parts of the world. That's why inflation trends is an important element of the growing changes in macroeconomic architecture or in macroeconomic processes on the global world. Also, the slide number 7, it's commodity market developments, and you will see that all commodities which prices has been absolutely stable for 5 years, at least from 2015 to 2020, are starting to grow very rapidly. And especially that's true for metals, for food, and for energy. In all the spheres, the changes are really very dramatic. Food prices have increased the most in low-income countries where food insecurity is most acute, adding to the burdens of poor households and rising the risk of social unrest. And this social dimension of the COVID-19 is now becoming the real driver of national policies in some countries and also on the regional level. We also should speak about the worldwide social crisis. At least the states of different different social systems demonstrate this growing instability and crisis. COVID-19 identified problems and contradictions in healthcare system of sovereign states that had previously been brushed aside. On the macroeconomic level, we see the high income inequality, increase in social tension, and absence of social cohesion, even in the European Union and in the transatlantic area, in countries which historically has been, setters of standards in this social dimension of public policy. On microeconomic level, we see the process of continuing liberal optimization of healthcare, the shortage of doctors and beds in hospitals, dependence on import, the problem of aging of population, which is common for the global north, continues to affect the processes in the labor market, public finances, and slow down in economic growth. That's why, for example, the problem of migration, which has been historically seen as an instrument to solve the problem of aging of population, demographic problem is now becoming the issue of acute political crises all around the world, and especially in my part of the world, in Eastern Europe now, for example, the border between Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania. Technological change and the trend toward digitalization remain and have even accelerated. One of the distinguished speakers at the beginning of our conference also emphasized the role of ICT in changing the global economy, but ICT are not able to solve the key elements of macroeconomic and micro level crises. Temporary reduction in migration flows due to the closure of sectors of economy and borders also is an important element of analysis. On slide number 9, you see the statistics about the closure and enrollment in schools in advanced and emerging markets. And you'll see that if in advanced economy, almost in the beginning of year 2021, the crisis has been sort of completed, and all schools has been in different aspects open, or fully open, or partially open. When we look in the emerging markets and developing economies, you see that still very significant majority, at least 15% of schools are totally closed, and some mix. I hope that during our conference we have a chance and time to discuss that conference and its impact on the future of model of development. Later, I will touch upon that issue in my own presentation. Also, the advanced countries need to deliver on their earlier promises of mobilizing each year since 2016 about $100 billion on climate financing for global South nations. And we know that COVID-19 pandemic is a good sort of excuse for some the most developed countries to cut these spendings and at least to limit them, but it's not the way how the international community should face both the environmental crisis and also pandemic. Talking about opportunities, first of all, I should say that international community and national governments reacted efficiently on the initial stage of the crisis, and they demonstrated the ability to take interests of ordinary people, wide groups of population, seriously for their, setting of policies, how to deal with COVID-19 and also how to reach the goals. The global economic recovery is continuing in late 2021, even as pandemic resurged in some parts of the world, for example, here in Europe. About 3% of world GDP was spent to anti-crisis support measures for the benefit of the general public by autumn 2021, according to statistics of the World Bank. And that's important. It's 4.5 times more funds were allocated in year 2020-2021 than during the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. So both the international community and national governments understand the importance of dealing in the initial stage of this crisis with the most acute and urgent problems. With debt levels at record heights, all initiatives should be rooted in credible medium-term frameworks backed by feasible revenue and expenditure measures. Monetary policy of all types of countries, developing, emerging economies will need to walk a fine line between tackling inflation and financial risks and supporting the economic recovery. And we now have already different variety of national and regional strategies how to deal with these two threats, two challenges, inflation, and we need to support the economic recovery. And there's a special role of central banks here, I should say, to emphasize this topic of my research. And then I look into the action of European Central Bank, Federal Reserve System, Central Bank of Russia. We see that in many cases they could act quicker if the risk of rising inflation expectations are operationalized. Also, the new phenomenon which we have seen now can be named as vaccine diplomacy. Vaccine diplomacy, if you start from definition, this is the use of vaccines to develop a country's diplomatic relationship with other countries and improve its public image. So to some extent, vaccine diplomacy is a part of public diplomacy. At the same time, it's an element of governance, and it should be used to get access and to implement the resources of international community to cope with the threats of COVID-19 pandemic on national level. That's why today, like 100 years ago, then scholars just started to study international relations. They applied the concepts of power politics, balance of power, or multipolarity. That's more recent conception. When we talk about the competition of vaccines for access to the global community, we should apply these terms. So we have the problematics of mutual recognition of vaccines, and the United States and European Union are rejecting to recognize vaccines from China, Russia, and other countries, which is not good. Also, the issue of intellectual property rights and their protection is important because if we will follow these standards of protection of intellectual property rights, as it should be according to legislation. There are billions of people on our planet who will never have access to vaccines. We should keep in mind some positive examples. People's Republic of China is providing its vaccine free to Chinese citizens, to citizens of 53 countries along the project, which is known now as a health. Silk Road Russia is providing its vaccines to about 60 countries and outsource its production in many countries, first of all in Latin America and also in former Soviet Union. Information Russia's supplies of its vaccine abroad is not publicly available. Unfortunately, details of the contract have not been disclosed up to now, but we have the general statistics. Billions of doses of Sputnik 19, Epivac, Corona, and other vaccines at the market today. Talking about the more broad issue of development, the pattern of development in contemporary world as a consequence of pandemic, I would like to emphasize some points. First of all, the governments of many countries in both the global north and global south were able to prevent mass unemployment and the impoverishment of the population during initial stage of pandemic. We have in mind social protection programs, including programs to help their poor people, providing liquidity to them, the quantitative easing, and some elements of macro and micro economic management. COVID-19 demonstrated a clear link between socioeconomic inequality and the magnitude of losses, not only economic or social, but also on the human scale. Also, we find out the weak institutions which should be improved and modernized. High income inequality countries like Russia, United States, or Brazil are characterized by higher morbidity and mortality rates from coronavirus, and their population have lower vaccine rates, which is clearly the demonstration of distrust to public institutions. Coming back to the issue which is more common to my country, Russian Federation, I would say that Russia has been able to register its vaccine Sputnik V as the first officially registered vaccine against COVID-19 in the world. It has been approved for use in 71 countries, a total population of 4 billion people, including, of course, India and China. Varieties efficacy is 97.6%, so it's one of the best vaccines in the market. From Sputnik 19, we are now moving to a new model of political economy of development. At least we here in Russia, in the neighboring countries of Eurasian Economic Union, we try to deal with inefficiencies and problems in this transition period from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. First of all, I should emphasize that after the destruction of the previous international order, Russia has proclaimed conservatism as its foreign policy doctrine. So-called reasonable conservatism is our ideology. It's a sort of Russian reaction of normative power of European Union or systems of values promoted by the global north countries, first of all, United States. Second, Russia is the only big power that does not seek to rebuild or eliminate the existing international order, but would like to provide its strengthening as the basis of its survival strategy in this post-Cold War system. And multipolar system should replace current Western domination within the liberal world order. This is also one of the lessons which we have learned from COVID-19 crisis. In the very conclusion, I would like to emphasize a number of points. First of all, international discourse on political economy of development in times of COVID-19 remains neoliberal and economically determined. States must support people as long as this stimulates the economy. Yeah, this transformation of neoliberal discourse into more pro-social and human is just in the beginning. The further liberal departure from the welfare state model of the 20th century is going on. You will see that deterioration of welfare system is going on in European Union and some other developed countries, and the emerging countries, they're joining the global system. Then popularity of high social standards and welfare state model is now in crisis, and we should reestablish it. Growing polarization of educational and medical services with a decrease in their accessibility to ordinary people and the basic quality. That is one or another lesson of COVID-19 pandemic. The group of 7, a group of 20 countries should fulfill existing dose donation pledges, coordinate with manufacturers and prioritize deliveries to COVAX with great initiative of United Nations to provide billions of vaccines to emerging economies and remove trade restrictions on the flow of vaccines and its outputs. The end of the pandemic will be a period of aggravating socioeconomic problems and further foreign policy polarization, especially in your part of the world. We here in Europe are watching closely on developments in Pacific Rim and India Ocean, in areas in Indonesia and around, and some processes are really worrying. First of all, I'm talking about the growth military alliance of United States, Australia, and UK, about initiatives like Quad, which is definitely confronting the Belt and Road Initiative or Russia-led Eurasian integration. That's why the lessons which we have learned from COVID-19 is that international community should cooperate more closely in dealing with the immediate challenges of COVID-19 and in constructing a more stable multipolar system of international relations. So at this moment, I would like to return, to give a floor to moderator. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Stanislav. That's very wonderful and insightful presentation. I just want to wrap up the topic that you talked before about the vaccine diplomacy, security, and international system, which actually this is very, very interesting and up to that. And I just want to highlight the challenge that you already talked before about environmental crisis and the opportunity that we got, like global financings, development, and an inequality. And one thing that strikes me about your conclusion about the international discourse on political economic development remains neoliberal and economically determined by state must support people as long as this stimulates economic. Thank you very much, Professor Stanislav. And we would like to go to the second invited speakers. Actually, in order, if you see in the rundown, Dr. Alvan Alfian will go to the second speaker, but there is a special request from Assistant Professor Doran Lee because the time of the United States is already midnight right now. So I'll give the opportunity to Assistant Professor Doran Lee as the second speaker. So Professor Doran Lee, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Well, okay. Before we give the opportunity to you to present your presentation here, I would like to introduce a little bit more about your profile here. Assistant Professor Doran Lee.
It's Associate Professor, thank you.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Associate Professor Doran Lee got the academic appointment from 2007 to 2009, visiting Assistant Professor in Comparative Asian Politics, Political Science Department from Amherst College. And from 2009 to 2010, Carl Lowinston Fellow in Law, Jurisprudence and Social Talk, Amherst College. And from 2010 to 2016, Assistant Professor at Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Northeastern University. And to 2016 to present Associate Professor, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Northeastern University. And Associate Professor Doran Lee got the education Bachelor BA cum laude from New York University and got MA from Cornell University, majoring cultural anthropology, and 2008 got PhD from Cornell University, majoring cultural anthropology with the concentration in the Southeast Asian studies and history. Without wasting our time, we will give time to Associate Professor Doran Lee. The time is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I am going to start my presentation very soon. All right, I think I've shared my screen. And today I want to talk about creativity under the rubric of methodology. So I want to take up the theme of the conference and thinking about how the pandemic has changed the methods that we use in the social sciences. So I am an anthropologist, but I'm also interdisciplinary by training. I was also trained by a historian, and I work in a department with sociologists and anthropologists. So I think my insights are relevant to a lot of different fields. So I want to talk about business not as usual and gesture towards a new normal in research activity. So I think during this time, there are 4 points I want to cover very briefly. I want to think about how to reframe fieldwork when our mobilities are constrained, when we cannot travel, when we cannot get visas, when some people cannot even go home or are stranded in universities. And I also want to think about how research methods can be innovations and adaptations to the challenges of our field site. I want to think about the pandemic and how it has forced us to reframe and also observe new sites of social change and human interaction, not just face-to-face, but in other sites as well. And then the last part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit about how to translate some of these insights that I bring from other places, from the United States primarily, into an Indonesian context. And I think that is a kind of open question and an open challenge that I hope others will take up in this conference and in the Q&A. So very quickly, what do we mean by field work? The usual understanding of field work is that it requires long-term immersion at the field site. It can be months, but usually years. So for example, I have been doing research in Indonesia from the year 2000 when I started my PhD until now. So that is quite a long-term immersion. It requires linguistic immersion, so learning a language, a second language, or a third language to be able to do the research in person. It requires participant observation, which is to gain firsthand experience by participating in social events or action that is important for the research. It's about learning the insider's point of view. So what are the local categories that are important? And then how do we analyze those local categories and knowledge, what we might think of as insider knowledge or traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge into academic frameworks that we use in conferences such as this. So here are a few innovations that have already taken place in fieldwork from the last few decades. And this is the kinds of methods I'm describing are common in the US. So a very old innovation to fieldwork to account for cultural change is diachronic perspectives, which is to take history into account and to give a very long view of how local lives have changed in relation to broader patterns. So not just talking about Indonesian culture, for example, in stasis, but more about cultural change over time. There's also a subfield of activist anthropology that is important now, how to use our research to change the lives and improve the lives of communities. Multi-sited ethnography is also an innovation that's been important for about 20 to 30 years, which is to design a research project across multiple sites. It could be different cities, it could be different countries. So multi-sited projects can be within the context of the nation state, so different cities across a nation state, for example, or they can be transnational across different countries and comparative in that way. And then lastly, digital ethnography, which is more and more common, is to engage in fieldwork in the digital world and by deploying digital methods and tools. So that is what I'm going to talk about for a little bit next, okay, which is relevant to the contemporary moment. So I take up this question of creativity from the conference to think about what methods are relevant to the contemporary moment. What has the pandemic erased in terms of its relevance, and what has it introduced as new innovative forms of doing social science research? And what tools have researchers in the US and other Western contexts turned to? So I'll give you a brief overview of some of these creative methodological innovations that anthropologists have been doing in the US. So digital ethnography has been on the rise for at least a decade now, and more people are conducting their research in the social sciences exclusively online. So here is a quote from a book by Sarah Pink, who is a well-known digital ethnographer who is based in Australia. And Sarah Pink talks about thinking about how to reframe our practices. So instead of listening to people talk, we might be reading their blog posts or reading their tweets. It might involve sensing and communicating in other ways. And instead of writing a journal article or a book, we might make a video, we might do a photography project, we might start a blog. So digital ethnography is already changing the tools of social science research and knowledge production. So what are some of the implications of these shifts in research methods? I asked these broad questions here to think about the long-term consequences of the pandemic. So what should we be more aware of? Are there inequalities embedded in our research structures? What are the hidden consequences of shifting our knowledge production in one way or the other? Can we expand our research agenda? Is the pandemic an opportunity to be more creative, to enhance our connectivity to other teams in other countries, for example, and to use the tools that we are using now for communication, such as Zoom, to expand and extend our research agenda? And then the last two questions are about inclusion and the researcher themselves. So how are the ethics of research changed by doing more and more online research? How are issues of inequity or lack of access also a concern? Because not all of our participants in research have good internet access. So I think that's an important point to make. Okay, so here are a few examples I want to give about how anthropologists, mainly in the US, have confronted the pandemic, especially the challenge of mobility when we were all under lockdown and could not really go anywhere or do anything. What would count as output? And the research output was still very important for our careers. So I'll give you some examples of what people did. This is called the Pandemic Diaries, and it was a class project by Carla Jones, who is an anthropologist of women and gender and Islam in Indonesia. So Carla Jones is usually does fieldwork in Jakarta and Jogja, but she couldn't go. So instead, she taught a class to her students where everybody did their own project, and then they published it in one of the top journals in the US called American Ethnologist. So American Ethnologist as a journal made space for this classroom project and published mini essays. One example was someone who used Instagram to think about the role of social media influencers during the pandemic. Another researcher looked at Twitter to think about how people expressed care between strangers in the online and offline worlds. And I'll show you this slide again, because this is the work of Professor Carla Jones, who, as I said, is an anthropologist of Indonesia, but could not go to Indonesia. So she studied grassroots movements where people distributed food and masks and mutual aid. And you can see in this graphic here that she's looking at grassroots movements around Jogja, mainly in Java and West Java as well. So many anthropologists presented different anthropological COVID diaries, and what some of the main conclusions were from these methods, these new methods that they tried, was that they found that there were debates about how people presented themselves during the pandemic as everybody moved their work online. So people working from home thought a lot about what they could wear, and found that there was a new norm in business attire, that people were actually wearing athleisure as the new work from home uniform. So a funny example would be a suit on top and relaxed pants on the bottom. There were also debates in these COVID diaries about individual versus collective behavior in public health. So some of the debates about mask wearing and washing your hands, for instance, were exactly about individualism versus collective behavior. There was also an interest in how other countries dealt with the pandemic. So actually during the pandemic, a lot of US researchers did a lot of comparative research into how other countries were dealing with the pandemic. They looked at COVID relief responses in Brazil, in South Africa, in Mexico, in China, in Vietnam, and so on and so forth. There was also a lot of discoveries about what organizations were doing, like NGOs or self-organized groups at the neighborhood level. So there was a lot of, as I said, mutual aid. There was a lot of neighborhood level care. There were mass donations. There were oxygen drives, and there were things called community fridges where people left food for other people to take. And if you felt like you could donate, you could put something in the fridge. So these were things from everyday life that researchers were observing and integrating and uploading online. And lastly, one of the sort of big flashpoints in the pandemic research was a debate over masks and what kinds of social values that indicated. And as you know, that is still a kind of hot topic in the US today. But there are similar initiatives in Indonesia, and this is where I would like to ask the audience to think about what you have seen around you. So how have Indonesian researchers responded to lockdown and the loss of mobility? You'll see that there are lots of research initiatives that are tackling the pandemic as well. So this is a screenshot of a group of scholars from Utenica, and they have started a new research project on media, culture, and the pandemic. And they do a lot of Zoom webinars where they also integrate, interestingly enough, the Indonesian diaspora. So often these Zoom seminars that Utenica hosts has speakers who are Indonesian PhD students in other parts of the world. So this brings us to thinking about the research question. So what kinds of questions can we ask? What is timely and what is appropriate for the pandemic? I'll give you another example of how a researcher who is an anthropologist based in the US and who's also a medical doctor introduced, I think, an important insight, a self-reflexive moment to show us, what kinds of questions should we be asking during the pandemic. So this is Michelle Muniqua's COVID-19 diary that she kept every day when she worked in a hospital during the pandemic. And she asks these questions: how do you know you're living through a crisis? And this is the sign of evidence gathering that she starts in this process. What were the signs of crisis that you observed from the past 18 months? And as an anthropologist, what would you catalog as evidence for crisis? So I think this is a good example of what creative methodologies can do, in that it gives you a new question form and asks you to identify change in real time. So here is my humorous example, which is if you look at memes and social media, you'll see culturally specific memes that tell you something about how the society is experiencing the pandemic. So in the US, the meme that was very popular for a while was about toilet paper. So as you know, there was panic buying in the US for food and for basic household items like toilet paper, and all the stores were sold out. And this was not only indicative of supply chain issues, but it was also a source of humor. So on the right, you see a meme where someone's trying to cut a paper towel roll in half to save money. And on the left, they're comparing it to a game of chance where you use a clawfoot machine to try to win toilet paper. And lastly, the last example about creative methodologies that I want to talk about is to introduce the work of 3 anthropologists who are women and also minorities in the US. Goksha Gunel, Saiba Varma, and Chika Watanabe wrote a very short essay called A Manifesto for Patchwork Ethnography. And this was really sparked by the pandemic itself. And their questions are really about how to rethink productivity and research in the academy. So how do we make research more inclusive? And what does that mean for them? Well, they say in this manifesto that we need to recognize that researchers are people too, that researchers are human with human needs, with mental health needs, with emotional needs, with other needs as well, and that they have responsibilities such as being a caregiver, such as taking care of elderly parents, such as the fact that they have young children, such as the fact that they have disabilities, for example, and that these all condition their relationship to research. And so the authors are saying that the pandemic has forever changed research, but that this is an opportunity for innovation. So what are their innovations? They are integrating decolonial and feminist insights to make research, especially the qualitative, long-term, immersive ethnography that we do, more fair and more accessible to more people. So what do they mean by that? They call it patchwork ethnography, where instead of long-term field visits, you can stitch together data from short-term field visits. You can use your intensive background knowledge to try to make sense of fragments of data, right? And also use methods and tools that go against the narrative that researchers must be at their field site in an unbroken period of time for years and years and years in order to generate publications. So these authors say that patchwork ethnography is not an excuse to be more productive. That is, each short-term field visit should result in more outputs, but rather to think about the limits of the researchers themselves and their positions, and to be more generous and inclusive and expand what we think is acceptable for data, for insights, and for the objects of our analyses. This might mean a researcher can go do fieldwork closer to home instead of going elsewhere. And my final point is about how to think about these themes in connection with another theme I want to bring up. So I'm adding to the words of the conference. Solidarity, creativity, and connectivity are very important, but so is translation. And I'm adding the term translation to here to ask, what do these methods and insights about changing research methodologies that I've brought in from outside, from the US, offer to an Indonesian context? And are any of them applicable or useful for Indonesian academics and researchers? Given that there are very different labor conditions, that there are very different kinds of institutions and universities and research bodies in the US, in Europe and Australia, and in Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia. So I think I want to start a conversation about the Global South and power relations in academia, to think about how we take these insights that we have derived from the pandemic and how we were able to work, but we had to work differently, and how to translate the efficacy of these methods as well as their value, how valuable they are to researchers upward to those in power. So my final questions and things that I'm curious about in this presentation and in this conference is to ask how Indonesian researchers have developed tools and strategies for undertaking social science research during the pandemic. And how do we translate these innovations to research bodies that grant us grants or permits or require us to publish? How do we make our innovations legible and clear to the institutions that hold power? And then finally, how do we transform research equity and ethics permanently to accommodate some of the hard-won insights we have learned from the pandemic, such as the fact that researchers have limitations and constraints upon their time, upon their abilities, and upon their mobilities as well. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Doreen Lee, for this insightful presentation. It's kind of new for me because you already told about the patchwork ethnography. That's really interesting. And of course, one thing that strikes me about your presentation, at the end of your presentation, you asked us, the participant, or I mean, like the all people in this conference, how Indonesian researchers develop tools, strategies for undertaking social science research. And actually, maybe if I'm a participant, if I were a participant, I will have a number of questions for your presentation, because we want to discuss about, like, as you already talked before. But beforehand, I think we need to move to another invited speakers, because we have limited time for this one, and I think we have a question and answer at the end of this session. And thank you very much once again for associate. I'm so sorry if I'm wrong telling this at the first time, for the associate professor Doreen Lee. Thank you very much once again, and we would like to go to the next invited speakers. Dr. M. Alfian, MSE. So sorry if I'm not correct spelling your name. Actually, this is he is my teacher when I was bachelor student at this university. I would like to invite Mr. Alfian. Are you with us?
Okay, yes.
Cool. Okay, before we give the opportunity for Dr. Alfian, I would like to introduce a little bit more about the profile of Dr. Alfian. Dr. Muhammad Alfian Maihuddin, MSE, was born in Klaten, February 15, 1973. Mr. Alfian is the head of the Political Science Master Program at the Postgraduate School of the National University, or commonly known as Universitas Nasional Jakarta, at Menara 1 Building, Jalan Harsono, RM, number 1, Ragunan. He completed his doctoral program in political science at Gadjah Mada University, Yogyakarta in 2015, with a dissertation on military and politics in Turkey. In 2014 to 2019, he was a member of MPR RI Study Institute. In 2018, he was a special staff to the Minister of Social Affairs, and in 2019 as a special staff to the Minister of Education and Culture. In March 2021, with the lecturers at the graduate schools, he attended visit to various universities in Ukraine and Turkey. He was authored several scholarly publications, including books titled "Becoming a Political Leader," "Military and Politics in Turkey," and Rashomon in the Indonesian Political Labyrinth. And without wasting our time, would like to invite Mr. Alfian. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, the moderators. I'm honored for opportunity to present my main ideas of this international conference as one of the speakers from a political perspective. But unlike Professor Stanislav and Associate Professor Doran Lee, what I said in this forum was more in the context of Indonesian politics, including the context of Indonesian experience in responding to the current pandemic. Okay, my presentation, moderator. In this international conference, Solidarity, Creativity, and Connectivity, I took part in presenting the theme from in the point of view of political science, democracy, governance, and sustainable development. Considering that my expertise in the study of Indonesian politics, I will complete this theme as democracy, governance, and sustainable development in Indonesia, experience, reflection, and recommendation. From this theme, it is appear the important keywords are democracy, governance, sustainable development, and Indonesia. Okay, next. What we want to talk about in political science is realm of the study of political development. The essence of political development refers to Huntington political order as opposed to political decay. The essence of political development in this context, democracy is integrated in political policy so that democratic country avoid the calamity of political decay, the estuary of an extreme condition of failed state. The democracy and technocracy are like two swords. Democracy requires public participation and respect for human rights, especially the guarantee of civil and political rights. Development is a planned and monitored technocratic action. Thus, in democratic state, democratic dimension and technocratic dimension are in line. Democracy, political development perspective. Political development requires strengthening political institution. The condition of state political stability in this context is built by progress of democratic political development. The variable of democracy became very important, if not fundamental, as an inevitable choice in democratic state. In addition, the strong political institution, it requires the presence of political actors who have a democratic mentality and understand the nature of democracy. Referring to the view, democracy is the only game in town. There is only one rule of the game in political contestation in a democratic state through democratic election. The democratic election necessitates public political participation. It also necessitates the implementation of principle of check and balance, where the government gain control from parliament and civil society. A sustainable development as an important keyword in my presentation. According to the UNESCO, sustainable development is the overarching paradigm of United Nations. The concept of sustainable development was described by Brundtland Commission report as development that meets the needs of region without compromising the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. Sustainability is a paradigm for thinking about the future, in which environmental, societal, and economic considerations are balanced in the pursuit of an improved quality of life. Again, this picture of framing sustainable development progress, economic, politics, ecology, and culture as the circles of sustainability development. Next, sustainable development, political dimension, democracy. Political dimension of sustainable development, there are many keywords: organization, governance, law, justice, communication, critics, representation, negotiation, security and accord, dialogue and reconciliation, ethics and accountability. This accord with Brundtland Commission basis on development that is guided by human rights principles. All of the point above reinforce the concept of sustainable development is development guided by democratic political process. Next. The experience of democracy in Indonesia, rising up and downs. Indonesia proclaimed independence on August 17, 19, and 50. As a democratic state. Indonesia is a democratic state, rejecting from the absolutely monarchy, and the founding fathers, the mothers, have a republic from a republic form, which means a democratic state. Indonesia is a state of law, the Riksdag, not a state of power, the Makstat. The Vice President, Edict, Maklumat Wakil Presiden, November, the government gave a public opportunity to establish political parties. Many political parties attended due to the political dynamic and of maintaining independence from the written on the Dutch. The first election could only be held in 1955. In the 1955 election, process for main political force, PNI, Indonesian National Party, Masyumi Party, Nahdlatul Ulama Party, and Indonesian Communist Party. Next. On 5 July 1959, Sukarno issued a presidential decree, Decree President, which contained a return to the first constitution and dissolution of consultative assembly. Sukarno practiced guided democracy and Nasakom, National Religious and Communist Political Experiment. This is where Sukarno authoritarianism emerges through presidential regulation, Masyumi Party and Socialist, Indonesian Socialist Party refusing to approve were banned by the government. Next. In fact, Sukarno's guide democracy gave a hegemony role to political power of the communists after the dissolution of Massimian Party and Socialist Indonesian Party. Such conditions made the armed forces, especially in the army, appear as political force in order to compete with the hegemony of Communist Party. There are triangular political rivalry, Sukarno, Communist military. The armed force carried out political campaign involving anti-communist civilian groups, the culmination of which was formulation of change to Secretariat of Working Group, Sekber Golkar. The tragedy occurred in September 1965, which was suspect as PKI coup, triggering sudden demonstration demanding the disbandment of PKI. I think this moment Sukarno's regime fell and the New Order regime under Suharto came next. New Order developmentalism. This is important to look how development occurred in the Indonesian experiment. The New Order regime made political regulation, making the political era. Presented the Sekber Golkar. Golkar started by the military and bureaucracy as election contestant, vision of political party. The New Order election, Golkar always won with more than 60%. New Order regime concentrate the nation development with a priority scale of 5 years or pembangunan 5 tahun pelita. It emphasizes the technocracy dimension, dominance of technical ministries rather than democracy, limiting the number of parties, supervising by mass media. More emphasis on security approach, not welfare approach. A corporatist development approach. All segments of society are organized and supervised by the state. Next. The failure of New Order developmentalism. In 1998, the New Order regime fell. This also comes from the failure of New Order developmentalism, which is marked by unmanageable monetary crisis. Many banks are closed, inflation rises, rupiah exchange rate falls, development into the economic crisis and political crisis. Foreign debt swells, Indonesian economic under International Monetary Fund control. Riot occurs in various cities. Demand for President Suharto to resign have surfaced, both in public protest and in parliament. Suharto resigned on 21 May 1998. Next. The failures. According to Andronov Janiago in his studies, the failure of development, rereading, collapse of new orders, the failures of new order development was caused by weak economic fundamentals of Indonesia, financial system that doesn't work well, concentration of economic growth that ignores development inequality between region, between groups, and so on. Social consideration, human rights, and the environment are neglected in economic development. Economic development relies on foreign debts. post-oil boom era in 1980s. The security approach is prioritized over the welfare approach. As consequence, the development trilogy, which prioritizes political stability, which is not democratically enforced. The pattern of development relies on mobilization, state centers, not participation. Next. Post-New Order, Reformation era, there were political change, restructuring more democratic political system, the presence of new political parties, multi-party system, press freedom guaranteed, constitutional amendment, limiting the term of the office of president, implementation of democratic elections, including presidential and regional elections, the role of civil society. But economic democracy tend not to develop. Big business actors play a role in economic hegemony. Dual function businessmen and politicians reinforce the role of oligarch in politics. Sustainable development in face with difficult obstacles, development that ignores human rights and the environment, oligarch centers development that denies the role of civil society. The thing above reflect paradoxical situation. One side, democracy is present, but the other hand, the oligarchy is strengthening. Next. Next. Okay. Jokowi government challenge handling the pandemic. Since the beginning of the COVID pandemic has occurred. The pandemic has an impact on weakening the national economy, which is felt directly by peoples. Several strategic projects, infrastructure were temporarily delayed, including the plan to relocate the new capital city and East Kalimantan through recently restarted. However, the government continues to pursue the best policy, despite experiencing limitation and obstacles in the fields. The general aid can be seen that handling the pandemic is getting more effective when compared to other countries. Indonesia achievements are quite good, on the right track. Several national events, such national sport competition or Pekan Olahraga Nasional, can already be held toward the end on 2021. Okay, next. The raising of Human Development Index. We need to appreciate to government performance that even through Indonesian facing the pandemic, the Indonesian Human Development Index, HDI, has increased. HDI in 2019 71.92 and so on. Source Badan Pusat Statistik. We hope that increase in HDE will encourage an increase in the quality of sustainable development. Next. Developmentalism in Jokowi government. Although the political system has changed, become more democratic, development policies in Jokowi era since 2021 have been marked by nation policies and that tend to be developmentalistic. Economic development is oriented toward economic growth, with emphasis the growth of investment through the employment creation law, Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja or Omnibus Law, which was agreed between the government and the parliament, which is dominated by political parties supporting government. Investment orientation is considered to marginalize labor rights and does not guarantee environmental quality, including the phenomenon of deforestation, which has become criticism of environmental groups. So it seems to ignore the paradigm of sustainable development. The strengthening of public anxiety about the government foreign debt, which is so high, but the government still claim it is safe. Infrastructure development that often does not pay attention to the priority of scale, including the construction of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed train that utilize state budget fund, so APBN. There is a problem in government policies related to public freedom in the digital era. Public criticism through social media is approached with practice of digital surveillance policies. These things tend to lead to the economic development pattern of New Order. Next. Reflection. As part of the academic community, as political scientist, I have reason to be concerned about Jokowi's administration, national development practices, which increasingly appears to have the pattern of New Order developmentalism, where democracy, governance, and sustainable development are not present optimally in national development practices. It is the obligation of academic and universities to provide input to the government so national development is in the corridor of balance between democracy, governance, and sustainable development. The historical experience and failure nation development in the New Order era has provided invaluable lesson for the governance as a decision maker in development, so as not to reap in the same failures. Next. Recommendation. National development should ideally be in corridor of balance between democracy, governance, and sustainable development. Policymakers must learn from the failures of the New Order in practicing developmentalism policy that did not pay attention to balance between democracy, government, and sustainable development, so that corruption handling is improved again, so that national development provide real benefit for progress of the nation. Sustainable development is by no means synonymous with failed development practices in the past. Rather, it must pay attention to best ways that take into account in dimension of democracy, human rights, and the quality of environment for its sustainability in the future. Next. Okay, I think it's good enough. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Mr. Alvan Alfian. That's so insightful and interesting presentation with the topic of democracy, governance, and sustainable development in Indonesia. As we As we know that the sustainable development conversation is rising time by time, day by day, in academician and also in the government, not only in Indonesia, but also in other parts of the world. And one thing that strikes me about the presentation also discuss about new order developmentalism and also the rising of HDI in Indonesia. And also it's mentioned also developmentalism in Jokowi's government, as we know that the Jokowi um, presidents and the parliament also commit to support and implement sustainable development goals. And also one of the most interesting things from the presentation comes to the recommendation that stated by Mr. Alvan Alfian that national development should be ideal in the corridor of the balance between democracy, governance, and sustainable development. And another thing that strikes me about, interests me about the recommendation that Mr. Alfian said that sustainable development is not the failure of the past development, but it should be the future development. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. That's so insightful. I think that there will be a lot of question and answer, or as well as the discussion for this presentation. And now, once again, thank you very much, Mr. Alvan Alfian. And
Thank you
now
very much. Okay.
we will go to the next presenter, the next invited speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Jaime Ottman. Are you here with us, Professor? Associate Professor?
Assalamualaikum, Pak Muzaki, Fala Muzaki.
Yeah.
Very good afternoon to everyone, and a very good evening to all friends and participants from other side of the world as well, because we are actually in one platform, but we have very different time zone, I think.
Yes, sure. Yeah. Before we give you the opportunity to present your presentation, I think that's also interesting and insightful. I would like to give a little bit introduction and introduce a little bit of your profile. Associate Professor Dr. Jaime Ottman is a senior lecturer in International Relations Program at Faculty of Social Science and Humanities, University Malaysia Sabah. Mr. Jaime Ottman started his 22nd year's career as academician in the Department of Political Science, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and from 1992 to 2005, and later 2006 to present, joined the University Malaysia Sabah as a senior lecturer in the International Relations Program, Faculty of Social Science and Humanity. For the academic qualifications, he got Bachelor of Arts in Political Science at University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and got Master of Arts, Economics and Social Studies, specializing in governments and politics from University of Manchester, United Kingdom, and also got PhD in Ethnic Studies, specializing in politics and civil society at Institute of Ethnic Studies, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Without wasting our time, we will give the opportunity for Mr. Jaime. The time is yours.
Thank you so much, Saudara Fadlan Muzaki. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. I think before I proceed with my presentations, allow me a few 1 to 2 minutes, to convey my sweet words, especially to the Universitas Nasional Indonesia, particularly the organizer, the panitia, especially my longtime friends from Fakultas Ilmu Sosial and Ilmu Politics, for inviting me to be part of this very important seminar. And then I would like to convey my salam pengenalan to all the panelists here, Professor Kachenko from University of St. Petersburg State University from Russia, Associate Professor Dorian Lee from United States of America, my friends, teman saya Bapak Dr. Alfians. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, selamat siang, very good evenings, and to all the participants, I would like to say the same word as well. All right. I think before I proceed, also I would like to know from the moderator how much time do I have for the presentations. If I may know, how much time do I have?
I think it's around 20 to 30 minutes, if I'm not mistaken.
20 to 30 minutes.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Before I specifically proceed with my presentation, I would like to clarify a few things with regard to my presentation this afternoon or these mornings. After listening to our first two speakers, presentation by Professor Kachenko and Associate Professor Dorian Lee, the two speakers, I think, has give us some macro perspective with regard to the state of the global community, with regard to the challenge and issue that we are facing as a result of this unseen crisis brought by the unseen enemies vis-a-vis the coronavirus. And then ever since the arrival of the coronavirus in our life, in our daily activities, without doubt, and then most of us, I think, agree that this particular pandemic or this particular crisis has really brought a very big impact on our way of doing things, on our way of connecting between each others, on our way of interacts among ourselves across the globe. So I think that is something that we cannot deny, something that we perhaps we have to face. Well, I'm not so sure for how long, but looking or gauging at the present situation, I think the crisis is still around us. It is still, the global community across the continent are still struggling to handle the so-called coronavirus. So, as per mentioned by Bapak Alfian in his presentation just now, Indonesian also without exceptionals, they also have to face the same thing as well. So to the Malaysians, my country. So my presentation today is all about the Malaysian experience in handling this particular crisis, in handling this particular pandemics. So hopefully something that I share here will benefit all of us, or perhaps we can share at this point of at this very difficult situation. It is indeed, as the theme of this conference clearly stated, that solidarity, creativity, and connectivity are at a very high demand for everybody. Not to look after themselves, but I mean, at this very difficult time, we need to look not just only after ourselves, but also our neighbors, our friends, how that we can come together as a unit, that we can come together as a community or global community to face this particular crisis. So, dear Panitia, I have not yet go to my first slide. Could you return back to my first slide? You just wait for my cue. So my cue will be next. When I say next, then you can start. Go to the next slide. So please, can you go back to my very first slide? Can you to my very first slide? Can you get to my first slide? my first slide, please.
The first one.
Yeah, the first one. Yeah,
The
yes,
first
please.
one.
The first one.
Yang di awal.
Ya, yang paling awal, yang paling awal, yes. So just wait for my cue, ya. Just wait for my cue. My cue will be next. When I mention next, then you know the panitia can proceed with the next slide. So what I will share in my presentation is a very much the Malaysian experience in managing the COVID-19. Basically, there is. Based on the other panelists' presentation just now, what we are facing at the moment are very much common in nature, and then the feature that the government, the society, from top to the bottom of the strata of the societal strata, for example, I think they are quite similar in terms of approach, quite similar in terms of engaging with this particular crisis. So I think. Malaysia is not exceptional. Malaysia also follow other steps as practiced by other nations or by other countries. That is not unique because we are part of the global community. We are part of the global system. Therefore, the way that we are handling are very much mirror to one another. Okay, so next slide, please. So as you can see that the photos there, the guys in that photo is the Malaysian Director General of Health. He's the one who have a very important role, has been given a very important role or task to the Ministry of Health. I've been given a very important task to face off with this particular crisis, this particular pandemic. And then, yes, the task that he's carried out is not an easy one. Since as far as the Malaysians politics, economic, and social is concerned, this particular crisis, this particular pandemic, historically on record, this is our very first crisis in a very large magnitude that we are facing, which is quite a surprise one. So everybody are unprepared. Everybody are not ready. Everybody are not anticipate that we will facing this sort of unseen enemies or this sort of unseen crisis. So basically, my presentations aims at sharing the structural management elements has per apply or has per practice or has per consult by the Malaysian state in coping and managing the threat posed by what I call as an unseen enemy. In this case, vis-a-vis the COVID-19 virus into Malaysian compound or into Malaysian soil since early March 2020, and then. This particular pandemic, globally, as far as the global system is concerned, as far as the global community is concerned, the pandemic that we are facing at the moment is not new. It's not new because we based on the historical record, the global community has once experienced this quite similar crisis. For example, the SARS. The bird flus, and then one of the most popular virus crises in the modern times, the so-called Spanish flu, for example. So this sort of or this kind or this pattern of pandemic or this pattern of health crisis is not new in the history of mankind or in the history of civilization. You can trace that kind of record. So the only thing that make this COVID-19 pandemic is a bit different, and at the same time pose quite a complicated challenge. Is that this particular crisis come into the surface at this what we call a digital era, an era whereby human beings are so connected with each other based on what we call a digital platforms or a virtual platform. So due to this kind of environment, due to this kind of situations that really have contribute towards more complicated situation, complicated situation for the government, for a government, for the government, for a community, for a society to handle this particular crisis, especially when come to the question of sharing the news with regard to any development, with regard to any order, or with regard to any jurisdiction has been announced by the government. So this kind of situation has add up another form of a challenge to the government to handle for this particular crisis, especially when we talk about the level of literacy among the various background of the society. Next, please. So this, my presentation, based on that particular background, based on that particular situations, my presentation argues that at this difficult moment, or at these difficult situations, the joint and symbiosis effort, I mean the interplay relation, the positive interplay relations, or the positive interplay roles between state and society are vital, are very much important in ensuring the state objective to overcome this particular unique attack, or this particular unanticipated attack of the pandemic can be can be handled in a very constructive way, or can be handled in a more professional and educational way. Next, please. In other words, what I'm saying is that, in other words, any sort of antagonistic relation between the state and society will hamper and jeopardize the nation's effort to combat this particular crisis. Why I'm saying that, especially when it comes to the Malaysian cases, because to the nature of the Malaysian society, we are very much a pluralistic society. We are very much complex society, a society that built on the very different religion, different belief, different culture, different ethnic backgrounds, different worldviews. So all these kind of features, or all these kind of situation, if we are mishandling, if you are not handled in a more proper wisdom way, it will lead to another crisis from one particular crisis that can cause is not exaggerate to say that if we mishandling this, it can cause what we call the end of the Malaysian state, for example, or perhaps at the end of the Malaysian nation. So that's why I'm saying that at my early statement just now, given to this particular situation, given to the Malaysian form of feature of society, so the Malaysian, be it any form of society or government official or government personnel, they can't afford to have any sort of antagonistic relation during this particular situation. And then I think, as all you know, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, country in Southeast Asia is concerned, during this pandemic moment, during this particular crisis, I think it's not exaggerated also to say that beside this pandemic, beside this coronavirus, Malaysia also experiencing what we call a political crisis. Even since our last general election in 2018 up until now, we have witnessed a quite dynamic change of our political leaders. So far, we at this very short period of time between 2018 up to 2021, we have two different kind of prime minister as a result of this particular crisis. So this is, I mean, if we have more during a question and answer session later on, we can see how this, the crisis this particular crisis if mishandling can also lead to another crisis. Okay, so this is what I call as a quite challenging times, really a challenging moment for the Malaysian to face as far as beside this particular pandemics. Next, please. So in facing off this particular crisis, in handling this particular crisis, as I said to you, there are two important ministerial that has been given the leading task or to take in charge of the crisis of the pandemics. One is the Ministry of Health, the other one is the Ministry of Science and Technology that will handle in terms of access into vaccination process, access into the to take control of the vaccine. Professor Kachenko mentioned about the vaccine diplomacy. Perhaps the other element that also come together with the vaccine diplomacy is the vaccine nationalism as well. So this vaccine nationalism is also among other situation that also creates some internal crisis within nation political structure as far as access to the vaccine is concerned. So these two ministry, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Science and Technology, has been given the task to set up the structural management effort, such as My Sejahtera device. So they have set up a special device in order to mobilize, all segments of society to be vaccinated. And then beside this particular device, they also established what they call as a virtual health screening application, whereabout apps. This including the enforcement of the multiple extreme measures such as a movement control order, which is not unique. I believe other countries also practice a similar regulation. Restriction control order, confined restriction control order (CRCO). Without doubt, all these measure, all this particular order or this particular regulation has to a certain extent has succeeded Malaysian state in compounding and controlling the virus from widely spreading its venom throughout the country. So I'm not saying that is a huge success of the Malaysian state in handling this by practicing this sort of structural management policy or structural management regulation, but at least to the moderate level of managing this particular crisis, in handling this particular pandemic. I think we can give a big thumb up to the Malaysian state in handling or in trying to calm down the situation, in trying to do their level best beside this particular crisis, as well as the political crisis, it also lead to the economic crisis as well. All right, next please. As I said to you, however, for the nation to structurally control the pandemic, for the nation, what I mean for the nation is not just only Malaysia. I think for the Indonesian as well, for other neighboring countries like Singapore or Thailand or Philippines, or perhaps a country across the globe. For the nation to structurally control the pandemic, it requires all segments of the nation reciprocal roles, meaning to say that they must come. This is where the time that the so-called nationalism, the so-called political awareness, the so-called political identity that come into play or into test, that really require your contribution, that require your roles there. This is during the crisis. the reciprocal roles are very much important. What more, in an era of highly dependent on ICT, society, socio-political literacy, be it individual, community, activist group, as well as non-governmental organization, they must enhance their socio-political literacy on the situational crisis, meaning to say that especially on handling the false news. I think during this particular crisis for the past 2 years, beside all those regulations, beside all those physical order put up by our government or by the government, we also faced with some kind of viral news with regard to whether we, for example, especially in Malaysia, there is a split view, a split awareness with regard whether to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated. So these are also become, quite negative impact that also creates some form of awareness crisis within the society. Next, please. So this is where information and fact. This is where that our level of literacy with regard to what is virus, what is vaccines, what is identity, what is true and what is not true, must be well checked and compulsory share based on an official endorsement. So this is really, again, as I said to you earlier, is a test of our political awareness. This is a test of our national anthems, like Malaysian national anthem or Indonesian national anthem. So this really reflects our test of political identity as well. So as far as the Malaysian's pandemic's COVID-19 management is concerned, the data shows that even since the COVID-19 hit the nation, due to the low socio-political literacy, the matter has contributed to panic behavior among the many segments of society, such as panic buying. This panic buying behavior, has been mentioned by Associate Professor Dorian Lee during her presentation just now, also reflects a kind of a global phenomena, such as disseminating of false news and photos via many forms of ICT platform. So this is again, another challenge for the government, for the society. As far as the government is concerned, crisis is one thing. Managing the information, the informing is one thing, and then for the society is managing their literacy is one thing. So this, amidst all this complex situation, what I say is, the level of political literacy from the society point of view are very much important, are also important, are vital in helping or in assisting the government or the state or the country in managing this particular crisis. Next, please. So these situations, as per discussed, as per shared just now, has created two opposite situational for the state to handle during the crisis. First, the crisis itself, and second, the virality of the false and unofficial news across society within the larger context of ICT nationwide. So this complex situation, again, as I said to you, is really a big challenge, and then also require a new method, a new perspective, perhaps a new way of gathering the data that reflects maybe it's not a new behavior, but perhaps how literate ourselves. So whether we are solid as a nation, whether we are really intact as a nation, is only come into the whether it is solid or not, is only come into the real picture when we are facing this sort of crisis. Or in other words, what I'm saying is that this crisis, perhaps the positive image or the positive impact of this particular crisis, it really unearthed to us. It really gives us unanticipated situation about the especially to the third world country, for example, especially with regard to the solidarity, with regard to the creativity, as well as connectivity. Next, please. So these presentations concludes that for any country, this presentation, my presentation, as far as the Malaysian experience with, in managing the COVID-19 crisis is concerned, for any country to deal with a crisis in a constructive manner, it is vital for every country segment. It is vital for every country segment, be it individual activists, as I mentioned earlier, especially the government and the people or the society, to be mutually symmetrical in their action and behavior, particularly their level of literacy. Even though it sounds a bit idealist, but then a question of solidarity, a question of creativity, and a question of connectivity reflects, must be put into test, that at the end of the day will determine whether we can, whether there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. So the team has put forward by the organizer really what we call really significant as well as appropriate in addressing and discussing the situational impact caused by this particular pandemic or virus. Next, please. So it has become of utmost importance wherein the digital age, especially during the digital age, the increased use and the exploration of information technology have created a new way of human interaction, especially when come to the sharing of any sort of news, when it comes to the sharing of knowledge, how this ICT has become the new platforms have become create some new form of culture that if we are not wisely or carefully managed, especially governments, it can cause or it can lead to another form of crisis within the crisis. Next, please. I think that sum up for my presentations. Hopefully, it is some things that we can derive from that particular presentation. And last but not least, thank you for listening. So I'm giving back the floor to our moderator. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the insightful presentation.
Pak Zaini.
Saya
Hendra.
Ya, Pak Hendra, apa kabar Pak Hendra?
Your presentation so great.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
We talk later.
Okay, talk later.
Well, that's so insightful and interesting. One thing that takes me into like the more retention when Mr. Zaini told us that everyone should enhance their social political literacy, because in the COVID-19 dilemma, the information and fact must be well checked, maybe not double, maybe triple, so on and so forth. But okay, without wasting our time, I think we should go to the next session, which is question and answer. I got the information from the committee that Professor Richard Professor Richard is not here, right? Professor Richard has something to be done and cannot attend this conference, so that's why the committee told me to go to the question and answer directly. Well, we go to the discussion session. I hope all speakers still be here, because at the first time, Doreen Lee told me that it's already midnight in the United States, so she can't participate until the end of this session. Well, it's still okay, I think, but now we would like to go to the question and answer. If the participant has any question, just put your question into the chat platform, or you can raise your hand so I can see you want to ask the question. So I will open, or the committee will open your microphone to ask directly. But before you ask your question, please please introduce yourself, where you come from, and which invited speaker your question is addressed to, and don't forget to open your camera if you want to deliver your question directly. Okay, I think we will wait for some times, and I think almost all invited speakers still here to answer all of the question. Okay, there is a first question from Aska Abadi. I will read the question because the question is in the platform, in the chat platform. Dear Sir Zaini, my name is Aska Abadi Amrurabi, one of the presenter in this conference. In Indonesia, there are two of many GSOs, like Muhammadiyah and NU, who took part in managing COVID-19 pandemic. How about in Malaysia? Do the NGO have a big role in managing the COVID-19? I think while waiting another question or other questions, we will give the opportunity to Mr. Zaini to answer the question from Aska. The time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Asia just now, yeah? Miss or Mr.? Mr. Asia.
Mr. I think
Mr. Asia. Okay, thank you for the question. I think that question comes under the umbrella of social movements. Yes, I think in Malaysia also during beside the role of the government, beside the role of the official group in handling this particular crisis, there are also what we call a charity works or charity assistance produced by the NGOs or by many layers of social movement, individuals, neighborhoods, charity movement that come into the surface as quickly as unanticipated, you know. So this is something that the positive side of this particular crisis is not just so much on the question of the social movement or the role of the NGOs in helping the governments to handle this particular crisis. It's also the level of awareness that also reflects the level of awareness among the many facets of the society or among the many different type of social strata. So yes, just like in Indonesia, perhaps I think across the globe, as we can see through the many platform news, you know, this particular so-called NGOs or social movements play their part, play a very significant roles to help not just only the government but also to create some level of awareness among the different strata of society in facing out this particular crisis. Then the answer is yes. Yeah.
And might we probably know that what is commonly known? I mean, the name of the NGOs or GSOs.
For example, the first Malaysian AIDS, the mahasiswa, you know, the mahasiswa also, and then the group of the that come quickly into the surface is the group of the entrepreneurs. You know, they come together. So Pak Marzuki, there are so many layers of NGOs group that we never recognized before. Then suddenly, due to this crisis, they come into the surface. So this is, I think, one of the positive situation that we can witness as far as social awareness, as far as social solidarity or connectivity is concerned.
Yes, thank you very much. I also heard the news, and I also read the news that some of the organization and some of the young entrepreneurs in Malaysia, they are actively engaging their rules in combating the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much for the answer, Mr. Zaini.
Yeah, you're welcome. You are welcome.
We'll go to the next question. There is Patrick here, already raised his hand. I think you can open your microphone and ask the question directly.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Mani, and I'm from Jakarta, from University Professor Dr. Mustopo Bragama. And I would like to address my questions to Professor Stanislav. And my question is, in your presentation about vaccine diplomacy, especially about the distribution of vaccine, you said that the group of 7 and group of 20 must distribute and open good management for the vaccine distribution, especially for those underdeveloped and still unmanaged country. And my question is, do you think that the underdeveloped country must rely upon those groups or the higher ranking countries, or should they approach the their vaccine management and their post-pandemic situation in their own way? Is there any solution about that, or it is a must situation for them to rely to the group of 7 or the group of 20? That is my questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for the question. I think we'll give the opportunity to Professor Stanislav. I think he is still here.
Yes, I'm here. I will be happy to answer. First of all, Patrick, thank you so much for your question. It's a difficult one because there are no singular, I would say, approach to dealing with the problem of providing enough vaccines to developing countries. First of all, there are two different approaches. One is based on the American and European vision that the common challenges should face by common sort of responses. In that case, the COVAX initiative, which has been very heavily promoted by United States and European Union, which has been integrated into the frameworks of United Nations institutions, is a response. This is a response which is to some extent transparent. Many countries can apply, can get that vaccines. The problem is that the policy is our own nation first. So the country which are producing vaccines, first of all, supply them to their own citizens, after that to the allied countries in the European Union, for example. Only at the end of the road, there are developing countries. Another approach is promoted by Russian Federation, by China, and FU. FU are the countries which are able to produce vaccines. So we are, my country, providing assistance on mostly bilateral basis or in the frameworks of more narrow sort of integration blocks. For example, Russia opened production of our own vaccine in almost all countries of former Soviet Union. We had production facilities in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, and other countries, and that is a way how we deal with the problem on bilateral basis. And fundamentally, this is political problem because of Russia really don't trust, don't believe into multilateral institutions. And for us, it's much more usual, I would say, to deal that on the bilateral basis. So from the point of view of sort of strategy of dealing with this problem of providing enough vaccines to people all around the world, we have two different approaches. Universalist, provided by the United States, and more by bilateral or more sort of narrow designed ways of assistance provided by Russia and China. So this on the level of strategy, but in terms of the mission itself, of course, the G7 and G20 countries should play the bigger role in dealing with COVID-19 simply because of they have own resources. Since they are, that's like an effect of economy of scale. The bigger is the the liberal economy, volume, that volume of trade, investments, and so on, these richest countries are benefiting most from that. And finally, I would say that the ideas from 60s and 70s, dependencia theory, which has been arguing that developing countries may just leave the international community, concentrate between themselves on the problems which are common to them. This approach is not functioning in today's world for numerous reasons. But first of all, because of the bigger economy is the more efficiently is a way of using its limited resources. So from that point of view, I really appreciate your question. And I believe that when we try to find the answer on the problem of COVID-19, we should keep in mind both the universalist and more narrow approaches of dealing with providing vaccines and production of vaccines. Of course. Thank you, Patrick.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So that's so insightful answer, but don't go anywhere because there is still a question for you, Professor Stanislav.
Sure.
It's question from Albi Aditya from University of Professor Dr. Mustopo. The question is about the latest news about the vaccine diplomacy. The news is that the few vaccines such as Sputnik 5 and NVX-CoV2373 and then CVN-CoV and Verocell is currently under rolling review of EMA. So if the decision of the vaccine is not approved, does that mean that the vaccine diplomacy can't run properly? So the time is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. A great question. I would say that it's sort of intriguing. As we know, since we all of us are in academia, we know that the negative result of research, it's still a result of your research. And when we have negative result from vaccine diplomacy, that simply means that we find out the new sort of features of international system. And if some countries are trying to prevent, to protect, or to put some obstacles for delivering of the best possible vaccines to consumers all around the world, this is a matter of what I presented in my speech as a power politics, balance of power approach to the area of vaccines. So Russia is applying, to World Health Organization, to EMA, and some other forums with a simple sort of pray, guys, listen. We have the well-functioning vaccine. We have absolutely fantastic statistics of that, and those who have been vaccinated in Russia is just doing simply very well. So from that point of view, these sort of obstacles which artificially created by the United States and European Union is considered by Russia as element of unfair competition and power politics. So that's it. So I still believe in vaccine diplomacy. I think that Russia is doing well in those countries which are politically or culturally homogeneous to us. I mean, former Soviet republics, so countries like Serbia, Argentina, Brazil. We have a number of countries in Africa. There is in Central Asia, almost all countries except Russia vaccine. So this is vaccine diplomacy. But as I said, the negative result is also a result.
Well, thank you very much for the answer. I also hope that the vaccine from Russia can also come to Indonesia, so some of Indonesian people can get the vaccine from Russia. Thank you very much, Professor Stanislav. We would like to go to the next question, which is addressed to Doreen Lee. Doreen Lee, I think you're still here with us, right?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, the question is from Andy Ashdian, and he asks that do the creative method that explains which will be temporary or have the future in the post-pandemic world? That's the question, and time is.
Thank you for the question. I think, there are a few things to think about, which is that I think a lot of people, especially younger scholars, my students, my graduate students, are already practicing these methods. they are integrating more digital methods. They're thinking about computational social science, but that requires access to data of a different kind. And so I think some of these changes are permanent, but one of the major challenges is the time lag between practicing these new methods and then getting recognition for them. So the more conservative bodies that researchers will have to, explain themselves to are the academic journals or the funding agencies or the research bodies that read research proposals and give permits for research. It could be, I think, an even bigger issue in countries like Indonesia, where researchers might not permit themselves to take as many risks because there is an impetus to publish in international journals, for example. And so the form of the research is very important, and most people feel that they have to conform to an international standard. So it's less easy or possible for researchers in other countries outside of the US to be experimental and creative in their methods. And that is, I think, one inequality that is a global inequality I want to highlight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the answer, but don't go anywhere because we still have another question for Doranly. It's the question from Devan. Why are people in densely populated countries so difficult to manage when the corona pandemic spread throughout the country? And Devan gives the example like Japanese citizens and also South Korea. I think it's the condition quite different. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question because it doesn't name a place. So I'm going to assume it's a question comparing countries like Japan and South Korea to the US, which is the context I know best. And I think, as in the other presentations, there is a sense of ideological issues at work. So the politicization of the vaccine, for example, is an issue in the US. And the people who are unvaccinated have various reasons for not being unvaccinated, but it often tends to fall on political lines. So I think, the pandemic management hits upon existing conflicts in society. And it's less about densely populated countries than in thinking about what the existing challenges are in each country. So, for example, South Korea, which did not get vaccinated until very recently, actually managed its outbreak fairly well because the surveillance from the government was so extensive and the citizens were so kind of disciplined, self-disciplined to following public health norms like masking or not going out, for instance. So thank you for the question.
Well, thank you. Little bit following question before you leave this conference. Do you think the Human Development Index, because Mr. Ottman Alfian already discussed about Human Development Index, do you think HDI in the country will determine how the citizens will follow the rule of the national health or not? And it will, of course, impact how the country will manage the corona pandemic.
That's a really tricky question because I'm a qualitative researcher, and so I don't look at metrics like that. But I think about preceding crises and how those countries have reacted to other disasters and how disaster relief efforts have conditioned society to respond to their governments positively or negatively. So have there been previous crises that would kind of provide a blueprint for people to understand how to act during times of emergency? I think that's important. So sort of recent history of crisis or disaster. Another factor could also be, one major issue in pandemic mitigation or pandemic management is also just clear messaging. So in the US, the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, which is the highest authority on kind of government policy for the pandemic has been criticized for being very unclear about its messages. So early on in the pandemic, the governmental body, the CDC, would put out conflicting information about whether or not it was a good idea to wear a mask, right? So I think the kind of consistency of government statements are important in a lot of contexts, and then actual recognition or denial of the problem, because we know that in a lot of countries, in some African countries, for example, and in some other countries, there are governments that are still denying that COVID exists. Right. So I think it's a very fundamental issue, and I myself do not turn to something like a Human Development Index to kind of give me the answer to these questions.
Thank you very much for the answer. Well, now we would like to go to the next question, which is addressed to Mr. Alvan Avian. It's coming from Dennis, Universitas Nasional. The question that next year Indonesia will play a role as the presidency G20. So what do you think it will be impact of our sustainable development index in the global level, because the reachment of our development, sustainable development is still low up to now compared to the other countries. Will Indonesia presidency G20 next year will impact to sustainable development in Indonesia? That's the question from Mr. Alvan Alfian, and the time is yours.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think this time is very important to the Indonesian government to strengthen the sustainable development. Indonesia is in the shadow of development failures if it is not the corridor of democracy, governance, and sustainable development. So that is a challenge for Indonesia in government development 20 as leaders. If Indonesia cannot give contoh yang baik atau the good illustration, the good models to implement democracy, government, and sustainable development, Indonesia can Indonesia dapat dinilai tidak konsisten, not consistent. This is pertaruhan, challenge, or reputation of Indonesia as a democratic nation is too important here. Indonesia is in the shadow of development failure is if it is not in corridor of democracy, government, and sustainable development. Therefore, it is the joint responsibility of all elements of the nation, including academic society and civil society, to improve the quality of democracy, support effective governance, and sustainable development. Don't let development depend on debt. The governments must be able to explore the sources of development financing and elegantly and independently. Development should not damage the environment Therefore, we must criticize deforestation. Therefore, we must criticize deforestation in the context democracy and public freedom. The protection of personal data must be guaranteed. The law of personal data protection must be implemented immediately. This is the text of government and the House of Representatives, in which the substance of the law must involve input from academic and civil society. The handling of pandemic in Indonesia is increasingly marked by increasing public awareness in complying with health protocol. What needs to be criticized is not to come up with policies in the context of handling of pandemics that actually creates conflict of interest between policymaking actors, governments, themselves. Communities should not be victim of the conflict interest in the policies. This the task of academic society to criticize our government policy. So the government always consistent in the corridor of democracy, governance, and sustainable development. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I just want to highlight and underline what Mr. Alvan Alfian said before. The community should not be the victim of the policy itself because it will harmful the sustainable development in the future. Thank you very much for the answer, Mr. Alvan Alfian. We would like to go to the next question, which will be delivered by Dr. Hendra Mojana Saragi. I think I will give you the opportunity to open your microphone to ask directly to the speakers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fadlan, to give me the great time to in order to ask. I would like to ask to Mr. Associate Professor Zaini and also Alvan Alfian, and after that, I will give also my question to, I don't know exactly the name, the professor come up from New Zealand, right? The first speaker.
Professor Kachenko.
Okay. So I will consent to Prof. Zaini and Mr. Alvan Alfian. Is there any impact of our relationship between Indonesia and Malaysia when we handling together about the pandemic? Is there any good increasing about our relationship so far? Because we know that Indonesia and Malaysia from this year, from 2020, the first year, until now, still have several people has been occurred by this pandemic, by Corona. So do you think the managing and the handling of Corona, of this virus, very serious for every government? And is there also any relationship, the serious relationship to handle together between Malaysia and Indonesia? That's my question for Dr. Zaini and Pak Alfian. Thank you.
I think Mr. Alvan Alfian and Mr. Zaini can answer directly the question.
All right, let me go first. Is it all right, Mr. Fadlan? Pak Fadlan, can I go first?
Yeah, you first, it's all right.
All right, thank you, Pak Fadlan. Thank you, Bapak Dr. Hendra Mojana, my friends. Well, I think if we look from the teams, the seminar teams or the conference teams point of view, is about solidarity. Of late, there are a lot of negotiation and bilateral talks taking place between the two countries or between the leader of the two countries. It's just that at this particular moments, Malaysian politics, as far as the federal politics or the politics at the federal level are not that stable. So it, in one way or another, gives some a big of hiccup to this collaborative talk between the Malaysian and Indonesian leader in trying to to come up with what we call a bilateral engagement in handling this particular crisis, especially when we talk about the Indonesian TKI in Malaysia, as well as the tourism sector between Malaysia and Indonesia. What more when Indonesians has made a decision to switch their capital city from Java to East Kalimantan. So of late there are quite a number of bilateral talks that also reflects that also includes the two government effort to come to join together to handle this particular crisis, but it's as yet come into what we call a solid action terms due to the we have yet to come into the decision to open up our borders. We have come to the decision to allow the citizen or the people of the two countries to cross the border, so that all the bilateral talks as well as the diplomatic engagement in minimizing the spread of the virus come into the very minimal level. But then again, from my personal view, for this to come into its empirical action, is also depend on the percentage of the vaccination taken by both people between Indonesia and Malaysia. So there is some positive move, as per mentioned just now, but at this point of view, I think it actually depend on the stability of the Malaysian politics at the moment, Pak Hendra. That is my take. That is my personal view with regard to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Pak Zaini.
And now go to Mr. Alvan Alfian.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Indra. I think cooperation between Indonesia and Malaysia is very important in the framework of bilateral cooperation to the two countries, and multilaterally at the level of ASEAN regional countries. I see Indonesia is quite proactive in opening cooperation in the framework of solidarity cooperation with ASEAN countries, which have the same interest in handling the pandemic, and also including with the Malaysia. Mr. Jaime has specifically explained how Malaysia anticipates pandemic and the border between two countries, and how Malaysia anticipates Indonesian workers in Malaysia, and many policy that illustrate the cooperation between Indonesia and Malaysia. I think tidak ada masalah, atau there is no problem between Indonesia and Malaysia in this cooperation to handling pandemic. I think in the future, the cooperation between Malaysia and Indonesia can be strengthened. So the handling of pandemic can be effective. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, do you have the following question, Miss Dr. Hendra?
Or perhaps Pak Hendra himself has his own perspective with regard to his own question. Yeah, maybe
No, so far,
from your face, I can see that you wanted to say something, Pak Hendra. Yeah, come on.
I don't know exactly how Indonesia and Malaysia talking serious about this pandemic, because yeah, in the middle of pandemic, changing power from Pak Mahyudin to Ismail, I don't know exactly how Pak Mahyudin handling the pandemic, and also how the Pak Ismail also handling the pandemic. But so far, decreasing about the number of the victim, so okay. So that of course there is the difference between Indonesia and Malaysia how to handle the pandemic itself. But in the name of solidarity and connectivity, I don't know exactly how they do that. That's my point is.
Yeah, in Malaysia they are busy with settling down their political differences at the moment. As I said to you, Pak Mahyudin and Pak Ismail are actually representing two different sides of political wagon. So it depends. As I said to you, Pak Hendra, it's all depend to how well is the Malaysian political elite settling down among themselves. Then only then I believe they can seriously take into charge all the bilateral promises as well as all the bilateral engagement with the Indonesia.
So we can still study a lot from Malaysia, and then how to handle the pandemic, right?
Yeah, to handle the two different things at one time.
Yeah, right.
All right.
Thank you, Pak Zaini. Thank you, Pak Alpian.
Yeah. You are welcome, Pak Hendra.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion between for other people who asked the question, and also for interesting and also insightful answer from the speaker. But before we end this first session, before we go to break session, we will still have one more last question to Professor Stanislav. I hope you are still here, Professor Stanislav.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, the question is from Novel Esra Yubel from Universitas Nasional. The question is regarding to Sputnik V vaccine. As we know that one of this vaccine destination is Southeast Asia region. In your point of view, is there any specific goals that Russia wants to achieve by this vaccine distribution to the Asian member countries? The time is yours to answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. First of all, it's a very broad question. The short answer is that Russia is using vaccine diplomacy. Russia is using Sputnik V, both as an element of public diplomacy, to change image of the country, to establish a community of people who trust Russia, who believe in its, research capacity and so on. And also, this is a business. I mean, Russia is not going to make a gift in vaccines. Russia is selling vaccines for hundreds of millions of dollars, and the market of Southeast Asia is important. But this is a much broader question for me, because of since 2014, since Russia is involved in a low intensity political diplomatic conflict with the United States and European Union, this pivot to Asia, turning Russian resources, political diplomatic resources to cooperation with Asian country is of the top importance for Russian state. And because of that, 10 countries of ASEAN, of Southeast Asia, countries with 500,000 of people, with a booming economy, which is specializing in some countries with different technologies. ASEAN is in ASEAN there is Vietnam, which established the free trade area with Russia. So we have free trade regime with Vietnam and involved in negotiations with Singapore. Russia is trying to develop its trade relationship with Indonesia and Malaysia, moving from selling of hardware, military hardware to all the flows of technologies, food, energy, and so on. So from that point of view, Russia is using Sputnik V vaccine as an instrument to get into the ASEAN market broader and to diversify its economic investment and trade links with many countries. So for Russia, Pacific Rim and ASEAN in particular are top foreign policy priorities for next decade. So from that point of view, this vaccine diplomacy is one step on this strategic way.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the answer. And for the distinguished participant and the honorable speaker, I think this is the end of our session one. Before we take a break, I think I will give it back this forum to the master of ceremony. Thank you very much once again for invited speaker and for the participant. See you in the next 1 hour after the break, and we will go to panel discussion room after this. Thank you once again, and I will give back to the master of ceremony, the MC.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Cik. Cik. Udah biarin mas. Cek.
All right, thank you so much once again to our moderator, Mr. Fadlan from National University. Please give him a big applause for moderating our invited speaker for today. According to our agenda for today, the time is showing around 11:56. It's time to have a lunch break to all the participants in Zoom. We'll be having a break lunch from 12 p.m. until 1 p.m. in Indonesia time. So please, participate with their break lunch. Come and join again to our Zoom. Thank you so much and have a great lunch. See you guys very soon.
Thank you.